Hello, world, all of you from around the world joining us today. Welcome to this, what will be the final EcoCiv Global Dialogue on Systems Change for 2021. It's been a fun year. And we are going to be ending with the topic of community. It's a great place to sort of conclude where we've been throughout the year and to sort of set the foundation where we want to go. My name is Andrew Schwartz. I'm co-founder and vice president of EcoCiv, as well as director of the Center for Process Studies and some other things. And I've got the privilege of being our moderator for today's dialogue. The topic, the title that we have, community and the common good. And common good, I mean in the very broadest sense, the good for everybody, everything, life in general. And the subtitle specifically thinking about structuring, or we might even say restructuring, human life for an ecological civilization, for the long-term well-being of people and the planet. So in framing this conversation today, there's some things I've been thinking through, and I think maybe our panelists can help shed some light on this as well. It seems to me that when we're talking about civilization, there are few things that are more descriptive of a civilization than the way that its communities are organized. I think that the way communities are organized reveal our values and our priorities, our assumptions about what it means for us to be human, to live together and to live with the world around us. And when we look at some of the major social environmental challenges that we have today, these massive social and economic inequalities, unprecedented environmental destruction, it seems to me at least that the way that human communities are presently organized in our sort of modern civilization isn't working. We need something different. So if we're going to facilitate what we might call thriving human and natural systems in the Anthropocene, it's really imperative to sort of reimagine and restructure the way that human life is organized. And we might even say what we really need are communities for the common good. So I've got a wonderful group of panelists joining us today who are going to share their insights and expertise on what it might look like to transform human communities for the long-term well-being of people and the planet. And my colleague Megan Anderson here is going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll get this conversation underway. Megan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you again to our wonderful panelists who've joined us today for this conversation. The first is Helena Norberg-Hodge. She's a pioneer of the New Economy movement and recipient of the Alternative Nobel Prize, the Arthur Morgan Award, and the Goya Peace Prize for contributing to the revitalization of culture and biological diversity and the strengthening of local communities and economies worldwide. She's also author of the inspirational classic Ancient Futures and Local is Our Future. She's co-author of Bringing the Food Economy Home from the Ground Up and producer of the award-winning documentary The Economics of Happiness. Helena is the founder and director of Local Futures and the International Alliance for Localism and is a founding member of the International Commission on the Future of Food and Agriculture, the International Forum on Globalization, and the Global Eco-Village Network. And our second panelist is Alexandra Mitsotaki. She's the co-founder and president of the World Human Forum, a global citizen initiative which has its symbolic base in Delphi. In 2019, she launched the Convergence's Greece Forum. In 1998, she founded the Greek affiliate of ActionAid, the International Organization Against Poverty and Injustice, ActionAid Hellas. For the past 10 years, she was in charge of the Hellenic Cultural Center in Paris, which she is now vice chair, with the aim of establishing a tool of cultural diplomacy for Greece in the Francophone world. Reacting to the financial crisis in Greece in 2014, she co-founded Action Finance Initiative, the first microcredit organization in Greece with partners ActionAid Hellas and Aid France. She holds a bachelor's degree in political studies from the Institute of Political Studies of Paris and a postgraduate degree in developmental issues. In the past, she's worked on the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where she specialized further in poverty issues in the developing world. And she's a profound believer in civil society mobilization and in citizen responsibility and their capacity to hold governments accountable at all levels of civic engagement. She's a member of the high-level roundtable of the New European Bauhaus, an initiative of the European Commission aiming to connect Europe Green New Deal to our living spaces. And last but not least, we have Young-Soo Kim, who is a landscape and urban designer at James Corner Field Operations, where he's currently the project manager for Princeton University's Lake Campus, Smith Hall, and Diagonal Walk projects. He was also the project designer and project manager for Columbia University's Large Square. Previously, Young-Soo was the project designer for Highline's 18th Street Plaza, New York, the Battersea Power Station residential building rooftop garden in London, and the Tsim Sha Sea waterfront revitalization in Hong Kong. Prior to joining field operations, Young-Soo worked for the visionary architect Paolo Soleri at the, sorry if I pronounce this wrong, Arcosanti Cosanti Foundation, where he led the design for the Lean Linear City proposal in Beijing, China, and primary copy editor for the book Lean Linear City. A well-published designer, Young-Soo also has contributed to books Conversation with Paolo Soleri and Substance, published by Princeton Architecture Press and the University of Pennsylvania, respectively. He earned his Master of Landscape Architecture degree from the University of Pennsylvania, where he was a recipient of the ASLA Merit Award. He also holds a Master's and Bachelor of Architecture degrees from the University of Arizona and is fluent in both Korean and English. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Megan. So we have a obviously very diverse panel with lots of cool experience that's different from one another. And that's on purpose, because guess what? Community is complex, and it needs all of these voices to sort of get our heads around what the future of communities should be looking like. So our format today, this is really hopefully going to be a dialogical and interactive conversation. So all of those that are joining us in cyberspace on Facebook or Zoom or whatever, please submit your questions for the panel or your reflections of the questions that are being discussed. And you can use the comments feature in Zoom to do that, or the comments feature on Facebook as well. And we'll, after about 60 minutes of a discussion with our panel, what we'll do is we'll go then into these breakout rooms for deeper discussion with all of our attendees. And hopefully that yield something beautiful. Cool. That's enough for the sort of introductory fluff. And you're all like, let's just stop talking, Andrew. Get into it. I want to hear from our panelists. So that's what we'll do. To get us started, community. It's a TV show. Maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't. What exactly is it, right? It's a term that gets used, I think, often as a sort of broad umbrella catch-all to describe groups that have something in common. I think in the context of an ecological civilization, that community sort of broadly includes how we live together. So it naturally involves an integration of all of the systems of society, all right? You're thinking basic things like how we exchange goods and services, so our economic systems. It includes how decisions are made and how power is distributed, our systems of governance, for example. It includes how we feed ourselves, our systems of agriculture, food production and consumption and distribution. And it includes how we design our cities, how we educate our youth, how we tell stories to one another, and so on and so on, right? So where do we start? I think is part of the challenge I have. If community sort of includes all of this, where do we begin? And maybe for our purposes for this conversation, we can just say, why don't you, panelists, tell us what community sort of means to you, and then maybe move straight into some of the problems that you see with the way that modern human communities are organized. Alexandra, do you want to take this first?
Happy to do that. Well, I would like to say that community for me can be very different things. And I think that is actually one of the problems we're facing today, because we as humans, each of us as individuals, are part of different communities. And we need different narratives for the different communities of which we are part. And let me be a little bit more explicit. If we zoom out and if we see the world from high up, then we are all the human community. We're the community of life on the only planet we have, the only place where we can live, where life exists. And we know that from the space science, okay? The Earth is the only place where life exists right now that we know of. And that means that we need to find a narrative that suits that type of community of life on Earth. And that narrative has to be a common narrative, because unless we find a common narrative to feel that we are all co-responsible to maintain life on this only planet we have, we won't succeed. So this narrative, the zooming out narrative, as I like to call it, is very important. And maybe I can use something that comes from precisely the space industry, which is something called the overview effect. I don't know who of you knows about what the overview effect is, but that's what the astronauts feel when they see the Earth from high up. They feel, where are the borders? Where are the borders? Where are the national borders? Where is the problem of division? What divides us? In the end, they have a sense of awe in front of the beauty of our Earth, but in front also of its fragility and the sense that we need to protect it if we want to have life surviving on it. But there's another narrative, and it is equally important. And that is when you zoom in and then you go down to your neighborhood, to your local community, to what we live every day. And there again, we have to be able to think differently. And I think many of you have very much experience in that other narrative. How are we going to live in communities that have been very much dislocated when it comes to geographical communities, but also in communities that have been too much focusing on the national level? And in the end, it's not necessarily that national level that we need. It's probably the zoom out narrative and the zoom in narrative of the neighborhoods, of the smaller communities that I think need to be working on the narratives. We have been working too much on the national. So this for me is the challenge we have, that we need to be able simultaneously to see each other as members of all those different communities. And I'm only talking about geographical, and obviously there are communities of gender, communities of like-minded values, people and religion and all that. But it's really not easy.
Yeah, you introduced a whole lot to the conversation just off the bat. This zooming in and zooming out, and how our local and global senses of belonging and community related to each other. I think, it's not simple. Helena, do you have thoughts on this?
Very much, and I very much agree with you, Alessandra, about the importance of putting more focus on that very local and the very global. I think you're right, particularly, of course, politically, we've been very caught up in a national narrative. And however, I also want to emphasize, as probably many of you know, I'm very concerned about the fundamental, basic community at the local level. And I would argue that when we look at the rise of the modern economy, we'll see that elites, trading elites, forced people away from their human scale, land-based communities into cities in the Western world, while they use slaves around what's now become the third world, to create a global economy that suited global traders. And the breakdown of the fabric of human scale community connected to place, connected to the land, to the water, to the soil, to the animals that people depended on. I think we need to be studying much more what that has meant. I ended up studying that because I ended up in a place where that community economy was still the center, of the economy. So the power to be in control of your own life, but also the responsibility, because you could see the impact on the water that your economic activity had, the impact on the soil the impact on other people. So everything was on a scale where experiential knowledge informed people and automatically led to greater responsibility. When we're enmeshed now in a globalized system where when we shop in the supermarket, we have no idea what happened to the soil, to the water, to the people that produced it for us. So it's creating this tragedy of people being blamed, particularly in the Western industrialized world, for climate change, for breakdown, extinction of species, poverty in the third world. And yet the individual is enmeshed in a system where it's almost impossible to take responsibility. So again, we need to have a systemic focus, to change all this. But to come back to community, I just want to say that I saw very, very clearly that when children grow up in a community that is more place-based and that fundamentally also is intergenerational, because in the more traditional economy, the elders had a fundamentally important role, including being very important caretakers for the youngest. This intergenerational community fabric linked to a deep connection to the animals and the plants, and as I say, the soil and water on which you depend, creates a fabric that is, I believe, essential for us to have happier, healthier futures. However, the community building that's occurring right here now among us and the potential to collaborate at another level is very important. But in terms of building a society and ultimately a civilization that's going to be healthier, we must rebuild that local community fabric, and it's going to require a shift in the economy to allow that structure of interdependence to be fundamental to the economy. Maybe enough said, I could say a lot more, but I think, those relationships are so fundamental.
It definitely, I mean, that rings true, I think, in my mind as well. I think one of the things you had mentioned among the many beautiful insights there is the importance of place. In Yongsoo, you're a person who transforms place, right? You're somebody who focuses on the built environment. What is the role of place in community, and what are some of the problems with the way that communities are currently relating to or not trying to intentionally relate to their environments?
I think so. I really appreciate actually Helena and then Alexandra's these insights. And then there's a joke that as a designer, the community is your arch enemy to get your project approved. But in the end, they are the real client. You have the client, actually our design will serve them in the end. They are the end users, and then they must be happy and they should be part of the design. And it's so important actually to engage them. So I think I have one interesting episode to explain that. So we are doing some the university campus project, and then we try to, in terms of community, we have on existing site, we have really bad invasive species, but that has really nice, the forsythia has really nice spring flowering color, the bright yellow, but it is really bad for the local native species and planting purpose. But to get your design approval, they actually wanted to keep the forsythia heads because they loved it, because they love the colors, because those colors stays with their memories of their township. So they were really strongly hard. But it was interesting that we had a really interesting planning board meeting with the community and the hearing, and then actually we proposed to some good native species that is from that area, that region. And then actually township landscape architect and the community accepted to replace the invasive species they have, and then actually moving forward. But actually going back to this is kind of local level conversation about the space and the environment. And at the same time, going back to the other conversation of the zoom out and zooming in, and then we are talking about community like really like Anthropocene, centered, like only mostly like when we talk about community, human community. But as a landscape and urban design, especially landscape designer, trying to put a lot of like planting trees and then like other shrubs and then like seed mixes, all those things. And I think we also need to consider this like the not human community, but like plant, like more like earth community or environmental community as well. So actually in that, like in the bigger scale, like zoom out version, we had actually the project actually overruns with the state park. And then the state park are very adhered to like their old planting species that were like from in the neighborhood. And then now like you see like all the climate change happening. And then like being resilient is super important for the plant communities. And then actually when we propose our more mixed and then more resilient plant community to the site, and the first actually the state park commissioner was kind of like, he stepped back and went, whoa, and then we cannot do this in the beginning. But actually we try to persuade them actually with the being resilient. We have like actually the US government did some interesting work that following the tree migration per climate change. So trees are actually moving, especially the maple trees. They need cold climate. They're moving for the north and north and north. So actually, if you put some kind of native species trees, but after like forecasting like next 20 or 100 years, they might not survive. So actually we propose like more mixed like planting community. And then actually in the end, like state park accepted that proposal. And so actually it was interesting. I have like interesting story of like working local with a community and then also like working global in terms of like the planting community. So like in terms of talking about the places, I think place also not only means for the humans, but at the same time, the place for the like planting community or the animals.
Yeah, it's you're speaking to the philosopher in me who's thinking, wait a second, so what does it mean to be human, right? And to be an individual is always to be an individual in community. And when we talk about human communities, it's not humans only that make up that community, right? It extends far beyond just humans and includes a whole bunch of relations with the more than human world and our natural environment around us. So that sounds then like a very different narrative than the one that dominates our economic sphere, for example. Is that am I right? Am I getting on that, Alexandra? That what we're talking about is actually a sort of a new narrative and a new paradigm of what it means to even be human?
Yes, but I would like to comment on what Helen said, because I think she's absolutely right. But the fact is that we're living in a world that is very different from the world how it used to be. I mean, in our own lifespan, the number of humans has doubled. The number of wildlife in the last 50 years has fallen 50%. We are living in an extinction period, okay? And this time, contrary to the poor dinosaurs, it's our fault on top of it, you see. So it's something really very, very important is happening. We are occupying the whole of the planet. So there's no way going back and looking at the kind of indigenous ways of living the way it used to be, as marvelous as this might have been for some people at some periods of history. But what is important is what we can learn from that, because there was a lot of wisdom there. And how can we take that wisdom, like for instance, the intergenerational thing you mentioned, Helen, which I'm a big believer in, how can we take that and test it in our new cities, in our new different placed communities? How can we reinvent our new communities with the knowledge from the ancestral intelligence and from the indigenous intelligence of the past, including bringing nature back into our cities, because we have as humans to limit ourselves a little bit, because if we continue as we do, spreading out everywhere, there will be no wildlife left. So we need to rethink, but we need to reinvent.
Yeah. Well, how we can move it forward is essentially by localizing economies. But in order to really see that clearly, we have to recognize that urbanization, as it has happened in the fossil fuel age, has massively increased per capita consumption. And this is a fundamental building block of understanding why localizing economies could very rapidly reduce the human ecological footprint very rapidly, while restoring more intergenerational community, restoring a genuine sense of belonging to the cosmos, a genuine sense of an ecological self. This has to do with helping people to have a deeper relationship with the living world. What fills me with so much energy and so much passion is that I am seeing that even though every tool that governments have, particularly taxes, subsidies, and regulations, are being used to push humanity in the opposite direction towards an urban future, every step of the way using more energy, more resources to replace people, particularly now with the AI city. We are talking about using masses of energy and resources. It's supposedly green energy, but it isn't very green at all when you examine it. So I would plead with people to please listen to this. Just think about the fact that in every one of these mega cities, every pound of food has to be transported. The infrastructure that goes into fueling those cities is enormous. Now, we are seeing that where communities start localizing, sometimes even within the city, as they start building greater community cohesion, start building more local economies, so they create a relationship between the city and the land around them. For instance, building local food economies. They are reducing emissions, reducing plastic. They are, very importantly, by shortening the distance between producer and consumer, the market calls for diversity. It leads to diversification on the land. So two very clear images I want people to keep in mind are the difference between a highly diversified farm and a monoculture. A monoculture can never produce more than a diversified bit of land, never. But we have been led to believe that fossil fuels and big machinery and big monocultures are the way to feed the world. And we are led to believe that if the entire human race moves into cities, we are better off. This is because we're being driven by algorithmic forces now, where the extractive capital that moves into creating wealth for bigger and bigger corporations are pushing us in that way. It's a long discussion. I'll stop now, but I please really reflect on, if you take any two bits of land, 1 square meter, 1 kilometer square, and you diversify, you will always be able to produce more. But to do it well, you would need more people on the land. So we actually have a formula for having more jobs, restoring nature, particularly in farming, but in forestry, in fishery, small scale, adapted, intelligent, more eyes per unit of land. We can restore and bring nature back to life. We need to be de-urbanizing and de-industrializing, localizing economic activity, and we could make huge progress. We can't solve everything, but this is the formula that can rapidly heal ecosystems while healing people.
Helena, I think that's beautiful. What you just described, but I also I want to push back and see how people respond, because I'm so intrigued by this.
Yeah.
I know at least two of our panelists. One is in Paris right now. The other's in New York City right now.
Yeah.
What happens to these quote unquote communities, right? Is there a place for mega cities? Is there a place for urban life to flourish? in with a future on localism? I'm curious. What does it look like?
So it's interesting, especially living in New York City. So I think I have to go back to Paulus really about this topic a little bit, but
always a good start. Yeah.
Sometimes I agree with it, sometimes I don't agree, but his core philosophy was actually minimize impact of especially human impact on Earth, which means actually he was insisting so hard actually densifying the city, and then like actually not to try to use natural land as minimization. So actually densifying means like it's kind of opposite what is happening where the Arcosanti now located in Arizona. So it's like Arizona is urban sprawl. You will see if you fly out there, you will see like single family home for like 100 kilometers, like from like one point to the other point, same monolithic, what like Helena was. That's the kind of economy. And then that's kind of typical American like urban or suburban like image you will have. That's American life. But back into the New York City, that's kind of opposite. So there was a like interesting book by Green Metropolis, I think by the New Yorker like contributor. I forgot his name, sorry about it. But he said like actually the consumption per capita in New York City is way less than the consumption per capita in the Phoenix. And then the time you spend in your car in New York City, I don't own a car. I always use walk, even like with the pandemic, I walk more, like I use mass transit more than previously. That's actually beauty of the living in the city and having the city. And then also like probably will bring more discussion, but New York, there are millions of different communities. It's kind of like sublime of the globalization, but at the same time localization. You will hear like 100 different languages in one street when you walk by, when you go to the Central Park. And then you will see their communities within them. And then also within the city, there are kind of interesting like food co-ops you can cooperate. And then you can get there's an idea of the farm to table that is slowly growing up in the city. So actually it is kind of interesting. And then at the same time, but I agree with Helena, there is a fundamental flaws of this system, how you grow the city. And then still like there is an idea of like, you still based on your economy of the growth. You should grow all the time. And then without growth, so it's because it's a system. So if we are, all our base, not only the cities, your life is based on. So it's kind of, there's an irony of this, like, but at the same time too, going back to Alexandra, I agree with it. Like we cannot go back. There's no way of return. I agree, but at the same time, there's wisdom we can get it from the Asian features, like people from Ladakh or the old people, what kind of wisdom they have. So it's interesting to see, and thank you for bringing this up. And then as a designer, when I see like actually people are surprised, you consume way less in New York City than the Phoenix or Houston or LA.
I just really quickly need to respond to that, just to say that the comparison between New York and those cities is meaningless. We must get out of the worldview of industrialism. Industrialism is the age when we thought we had cheap fossil fuels, which were never cheap. It was a lie. It was an economic lie. And we distorted the whole economy to replace people with more and more machinery. And it's particularly clear in farming. So I'm not talking about people going back to the land, a suburban sprawl and driving their cars. We're talking about smaller cities. We're actually talking about, generally speaking, people living alone, one family on the land is going to be highly inefficient and wasteful of land and resources. We're talking about smaller cities. And we really need to now be asking, do we want to support the dominant trend, which is going to be towards bigger and bigger mega cities? Beijing already has the equivalent of 60 million people because of 18 satellite cities. When I was living in Paris in the 70s, we had these fabulous markets, food markets. Almost all the food came from the region. After, even by the 90s in France and in Paris, you would find garlic from China, because it was now cheaper than French garlic. You would find grapes from Argentina with a label on it saying European patent. This was a process, particularly since the late 80s, of a globalizing path where global corporations have had far too much influence. Not as bad people, very good people in many of those corporations, very intelligent, caring people, but they were not being forced to look at the relationship between their growth, the growth of megacities, and the destruction of democracy, the growth of their influence of their worldview on academia, on media. And these relationships we need to look at without blame, without, it's a system, as you said, Jansa. I hope that answers some of them.
I think that's a great response. It does something that you did mention, though, this concern about sort of a system of globalization in shifting our focus toward supporting and enriching localization. But what then happens to the global, or what happens to other, the sort of network of communities? Does localization entail isolation? Can we enrich local life without falling into sort of a fragmenting tribalism, where it's sort of my community versus your community? Can we have both? What would that look like?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm worried I'm dominating too much because I often talk and I have no idea how long I've spoken for, but I do want to respond to that. Localization in a meaningful way is not going to happen without international collaboration. It's not going to happen without a movement where people wake up to the need to focus on the economy, on the economic systemic path. Are we taking this path towards handing over more wealth and power to global corporations, or are we going to shift taxes, subsidies, and regulations to allow the small to survive? And I'm making the case that when it comes to human interaction with nature to extract wealth, small is beautiful, small is almost always better. It's almost always going to be more productive, and it's going to be best when it actually involves more human beings on the land. Right now, we have a path which is being very quickly pushed on us, where robots will be replacing humans on the land, where robots will be replacing humans in medical care, in education. And with the robotic nature of the global economy, with algorithms dominating not just social media, but media, knowledge, is a very dangerous situation. So absolutely, we need international collaboration. We need these discussions. We need especially better dialogue between more industrialized, urbanized parts of the world and less industrialized, urbanized. And we need to understand also, if we focus on the food economy, we'll have much greater clarity. If we really just stop and decide that food and farming is probably the most important sector to change for climate change, for everything we care about, and yet we do not focus on that enough. If we do, I think we'll see that localization is already proving to be the way forward.
I love it. And you're already touching on so many other things too, because now we have, technological unemployment as something to think about. We have this sort of paradigm in conservation that says humans in a place is bad, so we need to remove humans in order to conserve nature. And I hear you suggesting something different altogether. And it's that, Alexandra, I know you want to get in on this too. I want us to shift toward sort of a positive vision of what we're talking about. I'm not a good artist. Stick figures is the best I've got, and they're not even good stick figures. But I'm going to make all of you artists for us right now, okay? And you're going to paint a picture of the future. We're going to dream together and imagine the world that I think that all of you are trying to describe. It's this world of rich localization, rich human communities that are engaging positively with the more than human community of life, right, on this living earth. Let's say this is a future, maybe even not that too far into the future, maybe only 29 years, right? 2050. What does this world look like if we properly transform communities for the well-being of people on the planet? How are our cities actually designed? How are decisions made? And what are the power structures like? What is housing and transportation like? What is work and employment like? What about the economy, which we've been touching on already? How is the built environment related to the natural environment? I mean, whatever you want to include in your vision, dream with me and paint this picture for our audience. What does it look like?
Andrew, before we paint that picture, I think we need more clarity about what kind of crisis we are facing today. And
Beautiful.
I think the problem is we are facing not several crises, but all the crises are one. It's a civilizational crisis. We face an economic crisis of sustainability, both social sustainability, because inequalities have risen. When I was a young woman, I was told there was going to be a rising middle class. And that's what I thought. And I went to work in the global south, believing that they needed to have a rising middle class in Africa and other southern countries. And in the meanwhile, the middle classes in the developed countries I was coming from in Europe was pushed down. So clearly the economic sustainability, the social sustainability was not there, with inequalities rising. The ecological sustainability even less, of course. At the same time and simultaneously, we have a crisis of our political system. We have a crisis of democracy. What is the role of the citizens today in finding the solutions? And at the same time, we have a systemic crisis in our educational systems, because with the educational system as it is today, how can citizens be actors of change themselves when they are not pushed towards, then they don't learn critical thinking, they don't learn how to cooperate, they don't know how to be creative. So we have an economic, a political, an ecological, and an educational crisis all in one. That makes a crisis of civilization, a crisis of values. And we need a system change for sure. But we need to understand it first, you see, because we achieve it. And then what will help us to overcome that crisis? I think, and there I don't know, Helen, we might disagree here. I think we need technology. I don't think we can do this without technology. I think technology must be at the service of the human. Technology must not be controlled by few. So we need absolutely to accept that technology is needed. We see now the discussion about the vaccines. The world has become too complex, too intertwined. We are too many people on this earth to find solutions without technology. But there is something else we need. And that is something, we can call our inner development, our personal change, our change of our own values, of our own desires, of our own. I don't want this to be imposed to me from top down. This world you have been describing, Helen, so beautifully. I don't want somebody to come and tell me, this is how you're going to do this, like a punitive ecological paradigm. No, I want this to come from the people themselves. I want them to understand that they're going to be more happy if they consume less material things and if they make more friends. There is this beautiful saying by a Greek philosopher who lived in Paris, Castoriadis, who used to say, I prefer to make a new friend than to buy a new car. And I think that's it, And if we can reach a point where we feel like that, then we will be able to find the, to find a solution for those problems. And the last thing we need, and I want to say this, is joy and is happiness that comes also from the arts. I believe very much in the role of the arts. I believe very much in the capacity of artists to speak to our emotions, to our hearts, and make us feel good about all this and make us want to go in that direction. So in the end, if we see it like this, if we see the holistic crisis, and if we see that there are ways of addressing it, but as a holistic crisis, as a change of civilization, then I think we have already gained something. Because right now, what I observe is that people are sitting in one fora, they speak about education, other people worry about democracy, others again are talking about sustainability. Look what happened at the COP. It seemed as if somehow climate change had become a technocratic, a technological, something like a very rational thing that we could just solve with numbers. And no, it's not about that. It's something. So if we succeed in doing that, I think it will be already, a step in the right direction.
I just got to quickly respond because, you know, you are so in line with what I'm saying, but coming from a very different perspective and conclusion, I think. Because what I'm seeing is that all around the world, people are wanting community, are wanting connection to nature, are wanting to live more locally. And I hope you look at our materials. You know, we produced a film called The Economics of Happiness. And what we're seeing is that from the bottom up, without any support from government, no support from the media, no significant funding of any kind, grassroots initiatives are forging that reconnection, which means not only more friends, where you're my friend, but actually human interdependence, where people can count on each other to help provide for their needs, where they can start joint projects to build the local economy. And it's happening in cities, it's happening in the country. And like I say, again, if you look at the effects of it in healing people, because we have this fundamental need for deeper connection to others, this is a profound spiritual embodied need that we've been born with in our whole evolution. That's how we lived, more interconnected. So that is something that we must go back to, because that's the ancient futures. The fundamental message is that we were more connected to each other and to nature. We have to come back to that. How do we do that practically? How do we do that structurally? And yes, how do we use technology to enable that? But that means we've got to be very wary of AI. It did not come from people. It's not in the service of people. It came from giant corporations with multi-billion-dollar investments, trillion-dollar investments for top-down control and monoculture, large-scale imposition, top-down imposition. If we want technology to support, genuinely support people, genuinely support community, we need to have a lot of discussions about what kinds of technology will actually do that. Right now, I'm suggesting that the communication technologies like this one we're using now are fundamental, and we should use them precisely to encourage this better international, global understanding of a global system that most people are not looking at, because we're not allowed to look at it in academia or in the media. It's all bottom up. And it's definitely so clear that what we feel we're doing is helping bottom up initiatives. And we're finding that we get so much inspiration because people are so healed emotionally, spiritually, and practically they're reducing their ecological footprint. And that's really what localization is about. And the vision, I'll just try to say very quickly from my point of view, the vision, what would it look like, is that we get enough of these small initiatives coming together. And we have tried to create that by launching World Localization Day. And we've got some well-known people involved with that to help. And we are talking about ultimately a world ecological civilization, which would consist of this multitude of diverse, culturally, locally adapted, allowing for a flourishing of languages, cultural diversity, but united in our attempt to create this and to maintain it. And we need the communications technologies for that, but we don't particularly need 5G. We can use what we have now. We don't need to scale up to something which is actually supporting the top-down movement. I think we're beginning to see the change. Someone was asking, is there a place? We have an international alliance for localization. I hope people will come to our website, Local Futures. So we do have international networks. We have World Localization Day, which will be this year, the third year. Last year, there were 80 organizations in 30 countries. We've generally been, very international because this is absolutely fundamental to what we see. The need for far more international, deep dialogue to understand that the global problems we face emanate from the same centralized system and that the solution lies in decentralization. I better stop. Thank you.
Young-Soo, do you want to get in on this?
Yeah, I just want to just like designer's observation. Actually, during the pandemic, it was interesting. Like I live nearby the Central Park, and then I go to better often. And actually, one thing I noticed during the pandemic, actually, I never seen teenagers in the park before the pandemic. And then after this, actually, teenagers who try to appreciate, actually, I see it start to appreciate the nature. The park is not nature, but try to be in the park, and then more public space, they go out, because none of the indoor activities are not allowed anymore. You know what I mean? Like, so this kind of positive things like what pandemic brought, and actually young people start to actually in person, the outdoor is the only place actually you can meet in person, you know. So it was kind of interesting, like observation, kind of hope, and then people start to appreciate what their community is about, like what kind of like social, Central Park is kind of social capital they have in their neighborhood, and they come out and then intermingle together. But going back to like Helena's and then like Alexandra's, some of the discussion, and then one thing I want to add, there is like some catchphrases in the design field, design industry, like in 20s or 2010, it was sustainability. And everyone was about the carbon reduction and then CO2 level. And then like when I first studied that with Paolo Soleri, like for instance, like let's reduce the carbon dioxide by like 2020 by a certain level, then we can do this. And then like if all Chinese wants to consume like Americans, we will need like 7 Earths. But now we are in 2020, and then people are saying there's like no one is talking about the sustainability anymore. They're talking about now resilience. So this is different word. So we surpassed the level that we cannot go back, which means idea of sustainability somehow the model, although global economy or global like entities promoting, was actually failed. And then we're going back. Everyone is talking about the resilience, like how being a resilient, the Katrina or like hurricane or kind of disasters are kind of becoming common thing, and then try to fix those problems. But like sometimes, but as going back to some episodes in the beginning, but still I see some like hopes that like some in local level, like for instance, like locals in the nearby the university campus, they are not adhered to the invasive species anymore. They're willing to actually place the invasive species with the native species. In the state park level, they accept like they know like we failed in terms of sustainability, but they try to be resilient in terms of like planting more diverse trees to be like more adaptive, survive. But at the same time, going back to the fundamental level, like what economic model, what actually city model we want to build after this like failure. It's kind of question, like it's like probably next 10 years, there must be a different model than like no more like sustainability or resilience, but like probably fundamentally we have to discuss, I think should be on the table, not only for the like us, but like for the growing generation. I have one little daughter, she's only like 18 months old, and what like environment she'll be living in next 10 years is a big question. And then actually, this is like a personal episode. Actually, I'm a kind of global citizen because I was born in Korea in Seoul, and then actually I read Helena's book Asian Future. Actually, it was a gift from my very close friend, and then I read a book of Paulo Soleri and decided to go to Arizona to actually study the vernacular architecture. Vernacular means like actually it has to do with really like going back to Helena's philosophy. Vernacular is like vernacular technology is like a really localized technology or history or kind of wisdoms actually that sublime into the architecture, so that Paulo is part of that as well. And then I'm really happy to be part of this conversation, especially Helena was like really like early like inspiration for me to study architecture and landscape architecture.
Thank you so much. I also met Paolo. I went out to see him. I was also very interested in Arcosanti. But it was just this question of, do we want to keep urbanizing more? You know, how big should the cities be? This should be part of the discussion. You know, if you could imagine that New York would be basically the village and maybe a few high rises, and not that enormous sprawl of people traveling for hours to get to work. That's the sort of vision of the way forward. Smaller cities, we should allow villages to survive. They're being killed off everywhere in the world. We should be moving towards smaller cities instead of bigger and bigger. That's sort of one way to look at it.
Can I just comment on the use of words sustainability and resilience, as you just put it? I would like to use the word regeneration, okay? Because how can an ocean that is half plastic and half life be sustainable, you know? It needs to be regenerated. So if we could move from sustainability to regeneration, I would feel much better about it. And as far as the AI goes, you know, the artificial intelligence thing, I don't think we will be able to go without it. The question is, can we agree that what is needed is that the two AIs must meet? The artificial intelligence AI must meet the ancestral intelligence AI. And if they meet, and if they we recognize both, that we need both, then maybe we will find the wisdom to address the challenges of our times.
Well, you know, maybe I think another way to look at the whole situation is that I would argue that we need democratic technology, democratically determined. And that's not what's happening. And I would argue that once we were able to have a societal democratic discussion about where the technologies are coming from, who they're serving, how they're going to be used, I wouldn't worry. But we need genuine.
This is why we created the World Human Forum, and I mean, we chose an emblematic place, which is Delphi in Greece. I don't know who of you knows it, but it used to be the navel of the earth. So the oracle, people were going there to find the answers for the future, whatever. But the important thing for us was not so much Delphi. The important thing was that it stands for all the ancestral intelligence and the indigenous intelligence. And most importantly, I think we need a third space for those conversations to take place today, because there is no space, actually, come to think of it. We are scouting around, and we have the UHL and you know, all those amazing things that are happening. And if citizens like us want to look for them and find them, what is happening at the level of education? What is happening at the level of the discussion on democracy? It's all scattered around. It's happening everywhere, but we don't know where it is. So our idea, what we call it for the World Human Forum, is we provide the canvas for a new human narrative. And you're all invited to come and put the narrative together there, because nobody knows how it's going to look. And Andrew, I see your question, and I would love to dream with you. And maybe, you know, we can get a few things. But the truth is we don't know, and we have to find out together, and we have to build it together, and we have to build it, as Helen said, from the bottom up, from the grassroots, because this is what is already happening, okay? Hope is coming today from the grassroots. It is happening, you know, and I like something an African friend told me once. She said, you know, Alexandra, we listen to the noise that the falling trees make, and we don't hear the forest that is growing. And I think there is a forest growing, and we just don't see it, you see. But if we can see it, then we would feel much better about what's coming. And in that sense, I'm quite optimistic.
Me too, but I'm exactly optimistic because of that human impulse towards community, towards connection. And it's happening at the local level, the human scale level. And that's what's giving people life. And I do love this comment in the chat that it's also about animistic intelligence. And this is, again, is part of ancient futures. We're coming back into a more bodily connected, deeper, animistic connection to the living world, to all of life. And it's simultaneously an internal reconnection and a connection to the life outside of it. But all the time it's turning towards life, towards anima. And that is what the industrial system, urbanizing, technologizing, using more and more energy, was taking us further and further away from. So this is, again, the big turning, the systemic turning, is this reconnection to others, to nature, to ourselves.
It's amazing how you anticipated all the other questions I was going to ask in your exchange. I actually wanted to conclude with the question about what gives you hope. I mean, when I'm listening to you talk, you're talking about, you know, transforming community involves civilizational transformation. It involves transforming our economies and overcoming capitalism and overcoming industrialization and overcoming globalization and all the other Asians, you know, and the isms. But it's like, then what do we do? Like, how do we even begin? And you gave us some examples of things that are already happening. And then those are the examples that are giving you hope, right? It's the forest that's growing, and trying to tune into that. So I think that's wonderful. Are there any other things? I know we're coming up on our time here before we go to our breakout groups. Are there other pieces of wisdom you'd like to drop on us before we conclude for this initial conversation? Oh, now you're just holding back. I see it.
Well, I'm always ready to say more, but I feel I'm dominating too much. So
But I would like to finish saying something about what is really essential for us and what the pandemic has taught us about what is essential, because we have stayed all in-house for quite a while. And maybe many of us have understood that what was essential is not what we were thinking was. And maybe being physically with other people, with our loved ones, but also with people we don't know, but with whom we share certain values and certain interests. I mean, I would love to meet you guys, okay, to meet you really, and not only to see you through a screen. And that, I think, is the limit of technology. It is a wonderful tool to bring us together, but please let us organize at some point face-to-face meetings, meet really with people, have a drink together, sit under the moon, or listen to music, or go for a walk. I mean, this, I believe, is what we need. And if the pandemic has made us more clear about that, I think it might be, you know, one of the good things we can take away with.
Yeah, absolutely. Young-Soo, a final thought from you?
So yes, I think probably in terms of not technology, but like there's some interesting like story when Japan opened their border to like back into like 18th, 19th century to Western powers, but like when they held a moon seeing party, it's just like, so then they invited a lot of Westerners, and then all the Westerners brought the telescope, and then all Japanese were surprised. What we usually do in the moonshine and actually sit there, have a drinks, as Alexandra said, like just have a drinks and then make a poem about the moons and then talking about the moon and then enjoying the light. But now, like all the Westerners, I'm not blaming the Western civilization, but like they brought the telescope and just watched
I will.
the face of the moon instead of actually enjoying the poetic moment and then actually interaction in between human beings and then all the culture it brings together. So probably, yeah, at this point, like how we enjoy the moon or how we enjoy the next things to come is the kind of like, yeah, try not to like repeat that, like probably not overwhelmed by technology, I think. Yeah, how you enjoy the environment. You can enjoy the environment in different ways. Yeah.
Enjoying the moon, hearing the forest grow. Helena, a last word from you?
Oh, well, again, I just want to say that if you look in a way what Alexandra was saying too, from my perspective, you put on different lenses and start analyzing what's going on in the world from the systemic two paths that I'm laying out, the disconnection, moving us further and further from the land into bigger and bigger cities, allowing technology to intervene more and more between us and other humans, between us and plants and animals, that path versus the path of connection, you'll see that people are much healthier and happier and ecosystems thrive. I am so absolutely thrilled and hopeful by seeing how both people and nature can heal when there is that path of connection. But I just want to point out too, based on a comment I just saw, most of us have only seen rural communities that have been left behind, marginalized, stepped on for hundreds of years. So then we think, oh, I'd much rather live in a village in New York than live in one of these local rural communities. They're so dead and people are prejudiced and it's hopeless. Absolutely. I don't want to diss those communities too badly, but I agree. What I'm seeing is the new local, which is inspired by that deep connection to community and nature, and they are thriving, and they're happening in cities too. So, but it's a conscious lens shift towards the path of reconnection versus the path of disconnection, the path towards localization versus the path towards more globalization, the path towards genuine democracy versus corporatocracy. So these are some of the terms that we can use. Yeah.
Fabulous. That's a great way to conclude this portion of our seminar. Thank you so much. All three of you are amazing panelists. I think this is a great foundation for launching into our small group discussions and continue this conversation about what it would look like in your own context to transform community according to this new paradigm that's being unfolded here.